Thank you. Again, I'll keep this brief when I read out these minutes. So the last public business meeting of the University Philosophical Society took place last Thursday, the 21st of September, in collaboration with Improv She Wrote. And the motion before the House was rather irreverently, this House would rather be on top. And it was good fun. It was probably one of the best comedy bits I've ever seen. And to kick things off in first proposition, we had our very own Ava May Conway, who did a terrific job. And she, in her speech, explained the sort of complex and tense situation between four moving parts, namely herself, her boyfriend, her much beleaguered flatmate, and a very, very thin bedroom wall. It got even then more reverent when Sean McDermott from Improv She Wrote did a fantastic speech. He simply wiped the floor. We were dancing on tables and everything. And he then brought up a very bizarre story involving the next speaker, Lana Ryan, pegging and a 12-inch... I'll leave that to your imagination. We are in very much esteemed company here tonight. I don't want to step on any toes. Lana Ryan did a fantastic job. She put on a brave face. She did a great speech. She motored ahead, ploughed through, and... anyway. And then... Coming next up for the opposition, it was a duet between Avril Shields and Lauren Kelly. And I have to say, as good as they were for a supposedly improv group, it was pretty well rehearsed. But we won't hold that against them because they were very, very funny, and it was a delight to have them. And then our very own Conor Ryan did a fantastic speech, full of everything you'd expect Conor would say if you give him a platform. We really ought to stop doing that. I was very happy to see he took out one of the jokes, actually, where it's 5 pictures of things he'd like to be on top of, and your humble registrar's face was in one of those pictures. Not happening, Conor, I'm afraid. And then finally, to finish the debate, we had Lulu, who you might remember is the Maiden's winner in 2021. She snatched victory that year. I'm not bitter, but she did. She made a great renaissance, a return. She took the place by storm. We then put the motion to the House for a vote. A single person, very magnanimously, our president, voted in favour of the motion, and everyone else voted against it. So the motion failed. And that was the story of our last public business meeting. But today, we're talking about a very serious thing, about the environment. Pity your poor registrar who has to take the piss out of the environment. Does it not get enough blows enough? We're dumping things into the ocean. Pandas are dying, they're starving, it looks terrible. Trees are being chopped down, we're flying, crisscrossing all over the world. I think it's had enough. It doesn't need me to make any more jokes about it. I won't. I love the environment. In fact, this is it wasn't maybe funny, I'll say it anyway. I was cycling here today. I was cycling, of course. Thank you, Ziad. Yeah, step number 1. I do my best. And who comes across me, of course, on Rathgar Road, but Minister Eamon Ryan himself, pedalling furiously with a very stressed face. Must have been a very stressful meeting he had. Anyway, but we made eye contact and it was great. Anyway, so I feel like this debate is meant to be. I even had a delicious vegan lunch actually the other day in Govinda's off O'Connell Street. You wouldn't even notice there was no meat there. It made me reconsider my diet. Maybe we should eat less meat for the environment. It was delicious. Anyway, this is enough shy talking for me. I really have not written anything. I'm beginning to think my predecessor, Oliver, had a good idea when he actually wrote his speeches in advance. I might take a leaf out of his book. That is very much enough for me. I think we want to hear what our speakers have to say about this very important motion, so I will leave it to them. There being no further business, the meeting was adjourned.
Are there any objections to me signing these minutes as a true and accurate record of the last public business meeting? There being none, I shall duly sign. Welcome everyone to the University Philosophical Society, where the motion that stands before the House tonight is this House would be an ecoterrorist. For our student speakers, speeches are a maximum 7 minutes in length, and for our guest speakers, they have a full 10 minutes to indulge enrich us, not indulge themselves. With that then, after the first minute of each speech, there will be a bell. It signifies other speakers and indeed members of the audience can raise their hands to ask a point of information. And before the last minute, there will be another bell signaling that you can no longer do so. Then, at 7 minutes for student speakers and 10 minutes for our honourable guests, there will be a double ring of the bell, which means we kindly ask you to wrap up your contributions. We prioritise during our debate, so as a result, if anyone has any concerns about what was said tonight, our senior member of council, Max, is contactable at smc@TCD Full. Alternatively, I am contactable at present at TCD Full. Although we do prioritise respect, we also do encourage participation. And so if you hear something you like tonight, you can shout "hear, hear." If you hear something you don't like, you can shout "shame." With that then, introducing the speakers who you'll either be hearing or shaming. Speaking first on the proposition, we have Jenny Salmon, who is a UNF CCC Climate Youth Delegate for Ireland and fourth-year law student here in Trinity. Speaking second, we have Nathan Hutchinson-Edgar, who is our TCDSU Environmental Officer. Speaking third, we have Arabella Ware, who's a third-year English and Art History student. And speaking fourth, we have Saoirse Exton, the youngest UN advisor in history as a member of the UN Advisory Group on Climate Change and a founding member of Fridays for Future here in Ireland. On the opposition bench then we have speaking first Rehan Hanif, a third-year politics and deaf studies student. Speaking second, we have Dr. Surya Pratim Roy from the Law Department here in Trinity, where he specialises in environmental law. Speaking third, we have Amy Cox, a fourth-year law Paul student and a scholar of the college. Please do something else to say that. Speaking fourth, we have John Gibbons, an Irish environmental campaigner and founder of the ClimateChange.ie website. I would thank all speakers for coming in tonight. We're very excited to hear it. And with that, I call on Jenny Salmon to open up tonight's debate. Hear, hear.
Phil members, LawSoc members, and those of you who have had sex before. Sorry, I could know myself. My name is Jenny Salmon, and today I'm here to propose the motion that this House would be an eco-terrorist to a degree. By dictionary definition, eco-terrorism has two meanings: violent acts carried out to further environmentalist ends, or the action of causing deliberate environmental damage in order to further political ends. This year, as was said, I'm the UNF CCC Climate Youth Delegate for Ireland with the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications and the National Youth Council of Ireland. So by this role, I hope it's clear in my proposal of being an eco-terrorist, I mean the former and I'm not speaking about the latter. So let's begin by talking a little bit about what we think an eco-terrorist would or should look like. If you saw Trinity Flack's most recent post from Freshers Week where I was labelled a no tote bag campaigner, you might even be picturing me right now. Or perhaps some of you might have even pictured Greta Thunberg. Ever since getting involved in climate spaces, whenever I would talk about climate to acquaintances or friends, I'd often get the reply, "Okay, Greta," and something like that. So Greta is a hero of our generation and has been a key figure in fighting the climate crisis in recent years, but with that has come the branding of her as an eco-terrorist. I'll read a couple of tweets for context. Greta Thunberg is clearly mentally unstable, not only autistic, but obsessive-compulsive, eating disorder, depression, lethargy. She lives in a constant state of fear and just wants us to feel the same. Whatever, Greta. And then this one from Trump. So ridiculous. Greta must work on her anger management problem, then go to a good old-fashioned movie with a friend. Chill, Greta. It's laughable that people can condemn and try to mock personally a young person, let alone a young person who is fighting so hard for climate justice. Instead of engaging in the substance of her advocacy, it's easier for those who are profiting off the climate crisis to mock her personally. Another eco-terrorist I'd like to mention, who I actually didn't even know was going to be speaking tonight, is Saoirse Exton, who is a climate justice activist from Limerick and the youngest advisor to the UN Secretary-General on climate. Last week, as I'm sure she'll bring up herself, Saoirse was at Climate Action Week in New York and did some incredible advocacy work there. And RTE made a reel of this incredible person and her work, and these were the comments in the comment section. "How did you get to New York? Swim? I support climate change. I'm a pro-oil activist." So she flew to New York to complain about climate change, which is created by the airline industry, among others. Yeah, wait till she gets a job, mortgage, few kids, and has to pay for energy taxes. Oh, and did I mention carbon tax? Clearly just working on making herself famous. That's a plastic megaphone, and she's wearing shoes with rubber soles, laugh emoji. And then my personal favourite, because it's just so unfounded, she could really start by cleaning her room. And even personally last year before COP27, when I went with Concern Worldwide, I did a reel with RTE and the same thing happened. How much is her carbon footprint to attend that COP thing in Egypt? She's such a well-fed hypocrite. And I will admit, I did cry into my pillow for an entire night over this because I thought they were calling me fat. They weren't. So the point here is, I'll stop with the hate comments because I just don't want to seem like I'm doing that Jimmy Kimmel bit where celebs read mean tweets. We need to highlight that the public opinion of anybody doing anything or saying anything about the climate crisis is typically portrayed in an eco-terrorist fashion that creates divisive responses between everyone because there are still people who don't believe in the climate crisis. I'm sure you can imagine how annoying and infuriating it is for people who are trying to advocate for those suffering climate's impacts right now to constantly be mocked for doing so. Is it any wonder that climate protests happen and that the people there are angry? Nobody is listening to those who are speaking out about climate because nobody cares, because for the majority, ignorance is bliss. There is still a disconnect between those suffering the impacts of the climate crisis and our actions. For all of us here today, talking about the climate crisis and environmental issues here at this debate is a privilege because in Ireland and the global north, we're not currently experiencing climate's effects in the same way as other places. This is not an excuse. Last year I went to COP with Concern, and they're an international NGO that implements a huge diversity of programmes designed to address specific causes of extreme poverty in communities across 25 countries. All of their work has been permeated by the climate crisis. Resources that were already limited for working towards goals like ending world hunger are now even more limited because climate-induced famine, floods and drought are all exacerbating every single issue that they work on. When I first started the role with Concern, I said to them in the interview the whole reason that I personally wanted to take on the role was that I was a normal person with limited knowledge of climate change and for that reason should do the role. I felt like I couldn't speak to climate issues because I wasn't an expert, so wanted to learn more and raise awareness of the fact that you do not have to be an expert or climate perfect to speak about climate change. Furthermore, you do not have to be an eco-terrorist to speak about the climate crisis, but you certainly should speak about it. Normal people have to speak out because it is not good enough to leave it to the Greta Thunberg characters you know. The voices of those suffering now have to be amplified. Until this year, I still honestly felt like I couldn't speak on climate issues because I didn't know enough, and also part of me still doesn't want to be seen as this ape climate character. But recently that perspective has shifted for a couple of reasons. So first was a panel at COP where a girl who was only 14 years old was giving a talk on an organisation that she'd set up in the slums of Bangladesh to educate the people there on the Sustainable Development Goals and how to build your shanty accommodation without using plastic. I sobbing because it feels so unfair. Why are there people who are living in extreme poverty as it is, and yet they're having the burden of the climate crisis put onto them when most of us are doing so little? The second was also at COP when a 15-year-old girl called Shania, who's from Tanzania, gave a talk about her climate work there, and the same awful feeling of injustice came over me. The third time was at SB 58, which was in Bonn this June, and it's a meeting of subsidiary bodies between COPs to track progress and negotiate on things decided at the previous COP and set agendas for the next COP. And this time I was there with the Irish climate delegation as the youth delegate role, not with Concern, which made the whole experience quite different. It's a more private meeting for party-to-party negotiations with some civil society groups present, meaning it's much more difficult to get a badge to attend. So every day outside the conference centre there were protests from people from the global south who were denied visas and badges to attend and advocate for themselves. I've never felt so disgusting in my life for being there. It felt so incredibly wrong that I was there and people being directly impacted, displaced and quite literally starving due to our actions as a developed country were on the outside looking in. The climate crisis is a culmination of decades of capitalism and inequity, but it's not too late. It's only too late if we continue to collectively do nothing and rely on those who are deemed to be eco-terrorists. This is by no means a personal attack on societies who use tote bags this Freshers' Week, but I'm about to live up to the name of the No Tote Bag campaigner. So just as an example, and I'll leave LawSoc out of it because it's their debate tonight too. So the Student Union produced 3,500 tote bags filled with printouts and plastic gimmicks this Freshers' Week. And when I hear this, I just feel so angry because all of us, particularly as students, should know about the climate crisis. And I'd like to hope that everybody in the room today, unlike the people in the comment sections from earlier, do believe in climate change. So where is the disconnect between this overconsumption and our own personal practices? Keep an eye out for the rest of the year and see how many of the SU blue Domino's tote bags you're going to see around the campus by Hillary term, or even by the end of this term. Mara Jackson from the UN Earth Law Centre said, "No legal document can dictate what we value. How we live does, and that is what becomes enshrined in law." I love this so much because it matches perfectly with what I'm saying about all of us needing to become an eco-terrorist. How we live becomes reflected in policy and law, and the things that you care about are the things that people looking to be elected will suddenly care about. Be that your local TD or even at a college level, SU elections next year, just to tell whoever's heckling you in the arts block, you do not want a tote bag and just stick to Domino's codes because it's much more effective. As for eco-terrorist actions, an example that comes to mind is Just Stop Oil's blocking traffic during rush hour in central London. And in the Irish Times report on this, the headline just reads, "Just stop annoying people." Very funny quip from the journalist, but it is so missing the point. Ecoterrorism may not have 100% effectiveness, so just yesterday the UK government approved Rosebank oil field, which will create more combined CO2 than the combined emissions of 28 countries in the global south. But the point is, the people protesting this and talking about this are trying to do something about it, and not just being complicit in their silence. If it takes stopping traffic or throwing orange paint to just stop oil, then so be it. I know today I've been quite doom and gloom about the current state of affairs in climate, but the portrayal of anyone doing anything for climate as being an angry eco-terrorist has got to stop. Talking about the climate crisis is not about having a conversation on the end of the world. It's about starting a conversation with the people who've already survived the end of their world and seeing how we can ameliorate that injustice as best we can. I'll leave it there, but Chairperson and everyone in this debate here tonight for that matter, I'm begging you to be an eco-terrorist in whatever capacity that you can. Thank you.
A hot take that I wasn't expecting to be defending. Terrorism is bad, guys. So I want to clarify something at the end of Jenny's speech about the round. I agree, climate change is a pretty big issue. It is a thing that we need to care about. It is a thing that we ought to be doing other peaceful activism and other types of activism in order to stop. There's a distinction here between regular climate activism and ecoterrorism, and a word that has the word terrorism as a part of it. And I don't think that she's taking the motion necessarily in good faith, because just because all environmental activists get called terrorists by people from conservative parties or people who don't believe in climate change does not believe that they actually are that. I think this isn't necessarily taking the motion in particularly good faith. The motion is about whether or not this House would be an eco-terrorist, whether or not you would be willing to commit this type of act, whether or not you would be willing to get in the way, to block people from getting to work on time, whether or not you would be willing to light fire to the office or to a coal mine where plenty of people are working minimum wage, whether or not you would be willing to hammer a spike into a tree where there are loggers that are going to be going into that tree, earning minimum wage, going to that tree and to chop down that tree and earning money chopping that tree, who are going to be damaged by shards of metal that pierce through their face and end up harming them for life and leaving them permanently damaged. I think this isn't necessarily taking the motion in good faith. Being an eco-terrorist entails hurting people. Entails hurting people who oftentimes don't have the means of protesting or of supporting the climate in the same way that people who have the resources to be eco-terrorists can. That is, note, most of everyone on the proposition bench, notably, seems to come from a relatively, up higher place in life. They're all white presenting. These are all people who are able to enter climate activism from a very young age, who have the resources to be able to do this. These are not, but most of the people who bear the brunt of the cost of eco-terrorism are not people who have these resources. If you are someone who was stuck in traffic on that day because Just Stop Oil stopped traffic in order to promote climate action, and you were earning minimum wage, and you ended up not being able to go to work, not being able to drop your kid off to school, not being able to do that thing that you need to do to make ends meet, that isn't a cost that I don't think, that's just not a cost that I think we should be supporting on this side of the House. And I think irrespective of climate change and irrespective of this issue of the climate that I think everyone in this room probably cares a lot about and everyone in the world knows about, we all know that wildfires are occurring at a vastly higher rate compared to 20 years ago. We all know that droughts are occurring at a higher rate than before. We all know that global temperatures are rising, and we all want to do something about it, whether or not Just Stop Oil stops traffic or whether or not someone hammers a spike into a tree that ends up leaving your father permanently damaged, that ends up meaning that every time you meet your dad for Christmas, you have to confront the fact that he has a spike into his throat, that he is permanently damaged in a way that he couldn't have expected to be. I don't think this is a cost that the proposition should be defending, and I don't think that's a cost that's worth it. That's worth it, even if it does mean that we happen to have a few less tote bags on our side of the House. But I think even if the debate is about climate change, that eco-terrorism isn't the best way to have more climate change activism. That is, terrorism, famously, isn't a great way to get people on your side. 9/11 didn't increase support for Al-Qaeda. Like, when people read articles about Just Stop Oil adding more, like, stopping traffic in the news, they aren't happy about it. They don't want to support the climate movement. They get mad. People are pissed that they weren't able to go to work. People are pissed that people set fire to this coal mine. People get mad at it. And conservatives and the types of right-wing groups that typically are against climate change are able to lobby more and are able to use this hatred of this group that is doing this thing and weaponize that hatred in a way that ends up meaning that people vote against climate legislation. That ends up meaning that people end up having less tote bags, or end up meaning that people do a lot less of the pro-climate, pro-green activism that the government side is trying to support. So I don't necessarily know whether or not they do achieve the ends they're trying to meet. Additionally, I think that when you have these types of activism, or when you have things like ecoterrorism, as opposed to peaceful activism, the types of people who engage in ecoterrorism, the types of people who do set fire to these buildings or who do stop the traffic for Just Stop Oil, these are the people who we would rather have in political spaces. That is, the people who would be choosing to be an ecoterrorist oftentimes are the people who care the most about these issues, who are willing to take time out of their lives, who have the resources, I guess, to stop traffic, to take a day off work, to be able to do this. And these people, I think, it would be far better off for everyone in this room to actually go to their politician, send an email to your politician, start an email campaign, or do something that actually is meaningful than to make, a problem for someone who's outside of the political space, who doesn't have the resources to be able to do this. Yeah, go on, Owen.
Ari, do you think that activists committing illegal actions was their first choice and the first thing they probably would try to do?
I don't know, but I do think that a lot of the people I think some activists are inspired by Just Stop Oil, and some do decide to have this illegal action as their first choice. But I'm sure there are some people who choose illegal activism as a last resort, or who perceive it to be a last resort because they see too many options on the news and they want to use this as an excuse to not follow the legal systems that we have in place, as an excuse to not do the hard work that it takes to actually convince people to be on your side, as an excuse not to use the systems that are already in place for us to increase support for this thing that matters, that needs everyone to support it. Because the climate isn't an issue that affects any individual person by themselves. It's an issue that affects all of us. It's an issue that we all need to care about equally if we actually want to make a meaningful change. I don't think that saying that this wasn't my first option or this was my last resort is a real excuse or is a real reason for you to do something like, bombing a coal mine where plenty of people work on minimum wage, where they don't have the resources to, or they may not have been to college, or they might not be able to get any other job, where this is their only option. And I don't think that's very fair of, the government side to be supporting this. So Jack, at the end of this, is going to ask everyone to say, vote aye if you support the motion, or nay if you're against the motion. And I think that this first speech in a lot of these debates ends up getting washed away by everything else. I just want all of you guys, when Jack asks that question, to take a moment to think to yourselves, to think not about the climate change stuff, but just think about the human cost. Think about that coal worker who just lost their job. Think about that kid who goes home every Christmas, who sees his dad, who has that shrapnel in his throat, who is really harmed in this way, and think, is that a cost that I'm willing to stand by? Thank you.
I'd like to thank Brian for that fine speech, and I call on Nathan to continue the case for the proposition. Hear, hear.
Hello. Hello to you all, my fellow proletariat. The rise of not the working class, but the wanking class, I believe. So our last speaker has just illustrated some kind of, I think, bad faith arguments about what we mean with the word ecoterrorism. The Earth Liberation Front, which is probably the most prominent ecoterrorism organization, carried out a series of several thousand attacks, and over 99% involved no human harm to anyone. No one is talking about harming humans here. So I think we might want to clarify what we mean by the word ecoterrorism. No one wants violence against people. I have never come across any climate activist anywhere who wants to harm people. This is a straw man argument. This is like inventing this figure that is going to go out there and bomb workers in coal mines. No one's going to do that. Instead, what we're talking about here is bringing the damage to the people who have caused this crisis.
POI.
Over the last 30 years, we have seen the failure of successive governments. There has been no movement on the climate crisis. In 1992, the Earth Rio Summit happened. That was 10 years before I was born. And on that day, all the world leaders came together and said that they would solve climate crisis through the state mechanisms, the mechanisms which the opposition wants us to believe are the ways to solve the climate crisis. Political parties, legislation, etc., etc. None of it has worked. 30 years later, the world is in a more frightening place than it has ever been. There is a higher level of emissions, currently, than ever before, in the atmosphere. We have a higher emissions than in all human history, really, and there has been a massive increase in the amount of deaths, the amount of floods, the amount of famines. That is the real human cost that we are talking about here. The human cost is the people, the 9 million people each year who die of a polluted air. For context, that's several million more than died in the Holocaust, just for context, for numbers. So there's never been this greater moral imperative to act. What are we waiting for before we actually take proper action? Are we waiting for, 3 billion people to die? And then we're like, okay, maybe now. I don't think so. I think we need to act now. I think the time to act is now and not in the future. And so, how can we act? Ultimately, the reason that we are in the climate crisis is not because we are all using tote bags. It's not because we are all using plastic, we're all using plastic water bottles. This is kind of a bit illusory. The real reason that we are in the climate crisis is because a group of people, a group of rich people, the capitalist class, not to get all Marxian, but the capitalist class, the fossil fuel industry, have over the past 30, 40, 50 years looked at the human cost and looked at the profit. And they've said, we like people and all, but it's not our issue if they all die, as long as we have some money. And that's kind of the problem. And no government has been willing to stop that. If that's the case, someone has to stop them. At this stage, when we're looking at billions of climate refugees, we kind of need to look at what the most extreme action is that we can take after 30 years of failed action elsewhere. And so that's why we looked at things like ecoterrorism. And ecoterrorism in this case can mean things like blowing up a pipeline. Is that such an extreme thing to suggest when billions of lives are on the line? If in World War II, someone said we blew something up, you'd say, oh, that was justifiable. That violence was justifiable because of the human cost involved in letting the Nazis win World War II. If we looked at revolutions previously, if we looked at the Irish Revolution, a lot of people would say that was justifiable. But this is something that is an order of magnitude greater than all of those. If you have ever agreed in all of human history with a revolution, with violence being directed towards any infrastructure, then you should agree with ecoterrorism because we need it now. We have tried to do things like lobby our politicians. It has not worked. We have even tried civil disobedience, large-scale civil disobedience, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, have broken the law, and it has still not really worked. We still have emissions going through the roof. We still have fossil fuel companies raking in record profits. And it's then that we think, right, well, if none of this has worked, and billions of lives are at stake, and the reason this is happening is because fossil fuel companies can still make money off extracting oil, maybe we need to stop their ability to extract oil. Maybe that's where we're at now. And another thing is when we are violent towards this, it is because it is being violent towards us. The fossil fuel companies are being violent towards us right now as we speak. They're being violent to the lungs of the millions of people worldwide who have to breathe that air in. Those children who are starving because of famines caused by droughts that were exacerbated by the climate crisis. That violence is directed towards us, the people who are living on Earth. And on the other hand, we are saying we want to, here and there, destroy some fossil fuel infrastructure in order to allow humanity to continue to survive. The vehicles of oil accumulation, the vehicles of fossil capital are working as strong as ever, and the only way to stop them may be through sabotage. And that's a reality we have to face now. Yeah.
Don't you think blowing up pipelines would hurt the working class the most, as all costs would just go soaring up high?
I would say, when it comes to hurting, hurting the working class, who is going to be hurt more? Who is at the front line of the climate crisis everywhere? It is the working class. And I would agree that Just Stop Oil in some of their actions have hurt the working class more than others. But by blowing up pipelines and things, we're actually harming the people causing the crisis, the capitalist class. And I'd like to finish with a little quote from Rosa Luxemburg. And meanwhile, what have these leaders done? What have they decided? We have seen and heard nothing. Perhaps they are conferring profoundly and productively. Now, however, the time has come to act. Act. Act courageously, resolutely, consistently. Arm the masses, occupy all positions of power. Act quickly. The revolution obliges. Its hours count as months, its days as years in world history. Let the organs of the revolution be aware of their high obligations. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Nathan for that inspiring speech, and I call on Dr. Roy to continue the case for the opposition. Hear, hear.
I'd want to hang out with Greta Thunberg in a non-creepy way, and with members of the proposition if possible. So I find myself in a strange place where I agree with a lot of what the proposition has to say, with a couple of minor differences. The first one is there is no such thing as ecoterrorism. So therefore, this House cannot be an eco-terrorist. This is the first argument that I'm going to make. Second, I'm going to argue if there are any eco-terrorists in the world, it's Shell, ExxonMobil, and nation states. So if this House wants to be an eco-terrorist, it is basically Shell or ExxonMobil or a nation state. After that, I'm going to argue that even if we don't agree with the name eco-terrorist, we look at the substance of ecotage, there could be varieties of ecotage. Some of that could be very bad for a lot of people, as my colleague has pointed out. Finally, I would like to argue that it's possible to do civil disobedience and anarchy in a nice way, which has nothing to do with eco-terrorism. Okay, to begin with, the phrase eco-terrorism was coined by this gentleman called Ron Arnold, who was a pro-coal and timber advocate in 1983 in order to curb civil disobedience. So members of the Earth Liberation Front, contrary to what the colleague on the proposition have said, protested against the term eco-terrorism because it was a way to criminalize civil disobedience. So if you look at it that way, if you're looking at civil disobedience as arson, trespass, call it that. Do not call it eco-terrorism because that's a term which is used by the enemy to neutralize civil disobedience. Now, if you take, for example, I know I have to talk about this, the sort of protest in front of the Book of Kells for the rising rent. See, here's the thing. I didn't like the choice of the song they were singing. They were singing Hit Me Baby One More Time, which I thought for a non-violent protest wasn't a great choice. But having said that, they were protesting, they were peacefully protesting. They were not committing arson, they were not committing trespass, they were not committing any other criminal acts. Therefore, the temptation to call them some sort of eco-terrorist is something that must be resisted. On the second point, when it comes to eco-terrorism, if you look at the definition which the FBI has adopted on eco-terrorism, it says that they are any acts of violence of a criminal nature against innocent victims or property by an environmental or political group for such reasons. Now, if you look at the death rate of Shell and ExxonMobil in Nigeria, which goes over 45,000, if you look at the number of property damages in these countries, which go, in terms of thousands of acres, they are clearly environmental acts of terrorism which have been committed by these by these companies licensed by the state. So if there is an act of civil disobedience which we follow, it's an act of counterterrorism. The real eco-terrorists are basically the states and the companies, and any form of civil disobedience is a form of counterterrorism. Okay, so next, coming to the point of types of sabotage and types of ecotage that might be okay. Like assuming, for instance, let's stop splitting hairs about the appropriate word and talk about the real stuff that they're doing. Now, there's this movie on Netflix called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which you might have seen. It's one of the worst films I've seen in my life, but unfortunately, it's based on one of the best books I've read in my life. But you see, and I think it was released at a time when Netflix's emissions went up by 51% in 2021. But anyway, the point is, in the film, when one person goes to blow up a pipeline, he says, "I am an eco-terrorist, woo." Now, here is Andreas Malm, who actually wrote the book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. He says it would be catastrophic if any civil disobedience were to be termed terrorism. So the film basically bastardizes the central point of Andreas Malm's argument, which is any form of civil disobedience or sabotage has to be done gingerly, as he puts it, without the desire to turn it into a national theater or a random pleasure of putting up a tweet. So, which is why I do believe the whole idea of civil disobedience or anarchy should not be termed as ecoterrorism, because that can have counterproductive effects. Or as Malm puts it, it could be a counterflank, which is that people are basically going to discredit civil disobedience and anarchists if they're termed as ecoterrorists and looking at what they're doing. Now, as my colleague has pointed out, it's also an aspect of privilege that you perform acts of ecoterrorism. The best example, of course, came in 2019 when the Extinction Rebellion had a moment where you saw a white guy in a suit who belonged to the Extinction Rebellion kicking a black man who was trying to go to work because this man was protesting on top of the train. After this, the NGO Wretched of the Earth basically said that contrary to what the Extinction Rebellion says, which is being jailed is a privilege, the NGO basically said that's spoken like a white man, because being jailed is not a privilege for a large number of the population. Having said that, now I come to my sort of last set of points, which is if it's such a bad thing to sort of do sabotage or do things which the Extinction Rebellion has been doing, is there no way out? Am I one of these horribly boring law professors who likes the courts and the legislature? Well, yes, but I would like to say that in this case, I don't want to go down that route. Take two examples. One is the Keystone XL pipeline, which happened in the UK in 2009. Now, what happened was there were these guys who were backed by Greenpeace who took some paint and painted on the side of a company. They estimated, even if they were to be found guilty, the total damages could be easily covered without much problems when it comes to the finances. Second, they were able to use the lawful excuse defense. So in response to a point of information which a member of the audience had asked, which is that what if the proper institutions are failing? And of course, this is not the first choice of action for people. The answer is that the solution is to first try the normal method, and if it fails, then you use some sort of minor damage which makes a symbolic consequence without really affecting people's wallets and lives. And this is exactly what happened in the Keystone XL project. When they went to court, they said, look, we filed a petition, we were ignored, which is to be expected, and then we did this because there was simply no other way to protest against companies. So they were let off using the lawful excuse defense. So what I would like to argue is that acts of civil disobedience and anarchy should be shaped by the necessity defense and the lawful excuse defense, rather than some sort of eco-terrorism word which one rabid conservative white man coined in 1983. So the way to do it, I think, is also you'll find a couple of cases that have come up before the American trial courts now, where they recognize the necessity defense. The way this works is that if you can show that you tried normal channels and nobody was paying attention, and then you are able to pursue your actions if you're affecting only industrial property as against personal property and persons, then you are able to use the defense, or the court has the discretion to decide whether to acknowledge this defense or not, which can subsequently be used. So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is that I definitely agree with the proposition that formal legal institutions are failing. But the correct way to do civil disobedience and anarchy is to be mindful of class and race. That's one. And the second is to see whether formal legal recourse could have been taken, and if it fails, then you simply go with civil disobedience. So in conclusion, I want to argue that this House needs to be anarchist. I want to argue this House needs to engage in civil disobedience, but I also want to say, don't bear the mark of a terrorist. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dr. Roy for that fine speech, and I'm going to Arabella to lead the debate. Here.
Good evening, folks. My name is Arabella, and I am not a UN delegate, but I am Prop 3, and I'm really happy to be here today. To make my points, I will be speaking to the definition of eco-terrorist, attempting to construct some sort of moral framework out of what's been said today, and making a few points of my own, which I pray that you will all find both factual and satirical, maybe. I begin. Ecoterrorism involves the use of illegal tactics carried out to further environmentalist ends. Therefore, an ecoterrorist is using these tactics in the interest of the planet as a means to an end. At the risk of stirring any ontological boredom, I'd like to point out that this is already significantly better than committing acts of terrorism that don't have a means to an end. Like, consider a world in which people commit daily acts of terrorism without an end game. Therefore, side proposition is already very far ahead in today's debate. Next. The philosopher Jeremy Bentham believed that if a person could rightfully resist agents of law, then when they believe themselves to be oppressed, then all laws would cease to exist. This is a really sound point until you consider the fact that Bentham was an Englishman, and when you have half of the world colonized as fuck, you have to have philosophers that really stick to the rules. Now, I might work for the Law Society, but I sure as hell am not a law student. Rather, I belong to a much more bohemian class of arts block citizens, art history majors, which brings me to my first substantive. Sorry, this is so bad. The aesthetic qualities of soup. In October 2022, here you go, guys. I'm gonna pass that around. Activists from Just Stop Oil threw a can of Campbell's tomato soup at Van Gogh's sunflowers. Now, side opposition may consider this an alienating form of protest and one that discredits the movement, but side opposition knows nothing of art and of culture. Art is protest, my friends. Now, I do not need to lecture you about the fact that October is clearly soup season. That in and of itself justifies the act, but I will lecture you on the fact that the soft crimson and granulated texture of tomato color blocked really nicely with the exalting yellow of sunflower petals, and that Van Gogh himself was probably a massive fan of soup and hated capitalism. But the real truth in this argument is that art has served as protest since its conception. Impressionism itself was a rebellion. The sunflowers are a revolutionary deconstruction of antiquated ideas of art and a celebration of nature. And if you're going to throw soup at a painting in pursuit of climate justice, this was at least a thoughtful choice. Sorry, law students, but art and protest have never and will never be contained within the laws of man, and this, I assure you, is a really good thing. It's a foolish notion to think that we can contain protest within Western social structures. And I suppose that I must address the eminence of violence as it fits into the motion. We as a society kind of fetishize violence. It is a functional tool. It is a means to an end. Well, I would never say that violence against another human being is good. Violence in our acts garners attention. if it is the right kind of attention. I don't know. There's a lot of gray area on that. I mean, nothing screams I love the environment like hurling a brick through a megastructure. But violence is a key aspect of our evolutionary psychology. We can all pretend to be enlightened 21st century pacifists who solve the world's problems by long-winded speeches that rarely come to a solid point in the GMB on Thursday evenings. But it will never negate the fact that humans do respond to violence. I mean, look at me. Do I look violent to you? I'm wearing corduroys. Okay. The point is that violence, while we should not perpetrate it against other human beings, does force people to listen. It forces groups to act. Psychologically speaking, it is one of the greatest drivers of human ambition and efficiency. Nobody is ever faster than when they're running for their lives. I will make one final point in today's debate. Does anybody have a PLI? Okay. I will make one final point in today's debate, and that is about the media. Everybody's just obsessed with their phones, not me, because I study art and English, and I spend most of my time reading in galleries. But the rest of you? The reality is that we are no longer just fighting for a cause, we are fighting for people's attention. And to capture the emotional bandwidth of our society, protesters are forced to be outrageous. I say we embrace our modern tradition of absurdity and keep using illegal tactics to restore this planet. These are the true gems of our political landscape that will make it into your TikTok algorithms. I wouldn't know because I'm basically Sartre and I don't have TikTok. Maybe this wasn't the right argument to make, I don't know. But I conclude, friends, family, Lawsock, the Phil, esteemed guests, I am sure that my speech has persuaded you tonight. We must act swiftly, we must act ostentatiously, and we must act now.
I'd like to thank Arabella for that fine speech, and I call on Miss Amy Cox-Scholar to continue the debate.
Okay. This is going to be a real speech. Okay. Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, much like smoking, mullets, and voting for Sinn Féin, environmental justice is only cool when everyone else is doing it. I'm going to be bringing you two main points. Firstly, about how violence makes cooperation harder, and secondly, about how you're likely to ruin your life and, make it very difficult to achieve any kind of change or environmental justice. But firstly, I'd just like to apologise for what will probably be a highly unmemorable speech. I studied environmental law with Professor Surya Roy last year, and I gave a very half-baked presentation on the exact opposite of the side that I'm arguing tonight. And I don't think he remembers me, so I'm hoping my speech is equally unmemorable and that you won't remember me after either. But moving swiftly on. Firstly, I'd like to give a little bit of a rebuttal, actually, to side proposition. When they tell you that, all environmental activists, even the ones that are, taking direct action and, ramming whaling ships or, letting the air out of the average Joe's tire, are generally mean well, and that, we're taking them in bad faith when we say that they're doing things like ecoterrorism, right? I think that some activists are genuinely unhinged, right? Paul Watson was the founder of this organization called the Sea Shepherds Conservation Society in the 70s, and he was kicked out of Greenpeace in the 1970s for grabbing what is it called, a club out of somebody's hand because they thought it was too violent, that it might be used against seals in the Arctic. And he was famous essentially for leading the organisation that rams whaling vessels off the coast of Japan and Norway and Australia, which we love. I love that part. But the mental part is that he advised all of his followers and the readers of his books to, this is a quote, make up facts and figures when you need to and deliver it with confidence to the press. Yeah. He also said that truth is irrelevant. I mean, who on earth would make up facts and figures and feed them to an audience with complete confidence? I mean, who on earth would do that to get a kind of a result like a laugh or action? Like, we just don't think that we want these kinds of people leading our environmental movement, and we think that there's probably better people out there doing it. Right, so on to my first point then, on why people don't really like to break the mold. So I'm going to give a little bit of framing here for debating purposes, I suppose, that movements need a lot of support to succeed, right? Like, you can't just have like 5 people hanging out in like a committee room in Trinity thinking of ideas and not doing anything with them. Like, the idea is that you kind of get some kind of societal change and you change people's ideas and generally get people to get behind what you believe in, right? Like, this is what we mean when we say that you need to shift the Overton window. You need to tip public opinion in favour of your goals so that they start doing things that align with your goals, right? And we think that this is like a monumental goal that we need to achieve, right? Like, environmental justice cannot be achieved by any one person. It's a massive like monolithic task that we actually just can't even conceive of in this debate, and definitely not in a 7-minute speech. But we need CEOs, we need corporations, we need Biden's assistant to come up and whisper in his ear that environmental justice is important. We need general cooperation from all areas of society. So why can't kind of violence and destruction and destroying people's property achieve this, right? Like, we think that the barrier of entry is just too high for most people, right? Like, you won't want to get involved. Like, people are very law-abiding and they're very vanilla in general. Like, it's difficult before coming to Trinity to imagine yourself in a pair of Doc Martens. It's very difficult. It's not something that the ordinary person wants to do. It's not something they agree with. But you don't get buy-in then until you're in the environment and then suddenly you're wearing them and maybe you've got 3 pairs, right? The relevance of that is that we don't think that people buy into the environmental movement when the stakes are too high, right? Like, when you're being asked to go do unreasonable things, like create blockades or do let airs out of tires and stuff like that, right? But the second reason then is that did someone make a point there? Oh, go on. Yeah.
Can you not achieve more with 5 people by blowing up a pipeline than by convincing 5,000 people who don't have the power to do anything?
Oh, well, this leads me perfectly into my next point. Thank you very much. We think that those 5 people, right, they're easily ostracized then by the media and the people around them, right? Because, like, we can take a direct quote from the Irish Times, for instance, where if you have 5 people blowing up a pipeline, they'll say something like, group of ruffian scallywags ruin beautiful, beautiful pipeline with their grubby hands. With their grubby hands and their monkey wrenches, right? Like, we think that the media will always have links to corporations that make a lot of money from the industry. Like, Ari told me very conveniently 10 minutes before the debate that ExxonMobil's CIO, that's a chief information officer, I didn't know that, is actually on the board of Fox News. So why on earth would they be kind of giving favourable content to you in that situation blowing up the pipeline? So why did this matter, right? Like, we think that you, as an eco-terrorist, are never going to get that kind of good press, and that means you're going to be dismissed by the average person because, you know, they want to be living their vanilla life and they want their peers to generally nod and smile whenever they say something, and they don't really want to provoke any kind of reaction. So we think that's something that's not valuable and something that undermines the average Joe when they're working hard in the council to get a brown bin or something like that. Oh yeah, go on.
If media are already definitely going to support conflict of interests, it won't make any difference realistically if people are going to protest nothing about conflict.
Again, this is magic, leading me perfectly into my next point. So my second point is what's the alternative, right? Like, we think on your side of the house, right, you're likely to ruin your life and not really achieve much change. I'm going to paint a little picture here for you. Think it's 2023, it's Freshers Week in Trinity, you're a 4th-year environmental science student and you're reasonably good looking and you still have a good chance of making some friends this year. But 5 minutes later you meet an impossibly cool girl. She's gorgeous, she's got blue eyes, she's wearing a pair of dungarees and she's got a monkey wrench in her hand, and you think, oh, this is what it's all about.
She takes you over to her stand and starts talking to you. She's giving you her spiel, and you notice that there's a big sign on the table and it says Trinity Incitement to Terrorism Society, and she says, "Are you up for joining tits?" And you happen to be a lesbian, so you say yes. And basically the next thing you know, you're skulking around South Dublin with a big needle and a bag of lentils, and you're letting air out of tyres and popping the lentils in them so it's slow and nobody notices for a while. But essentially then the next thing that happens is that you're grabbed by the ear of some big burly man who says like, "What are you doing to my car?" And he happens to be the head of the master's program that you applied to, and he denies you entry, and suddenly you've lost all your opportunities and life is absolutely terrible. So that's my very plausible story. We think the alternative to doing this, and I'm over time now, is that we have lots of people who kind of agree with environmental justice and they're able to implement changes in their general life. And I think we're a unique generation in this regard, right? Because we've got, well, like most of us now have done at some stage a little bit of education about climate justice, which is actually a first. Like the generation, like millennials, did they ever get taught about climate? Do they care? I don't know. But we, Gen Zs, are perfectly happy to sit there and argue to their heart's content about one thing or another with their parents and with other people. So I think if we infiltrate slowly, we can kind of have this kind of lean-in environmentalist movement. Sorry, yeah. And that'll be much better. Thank you.
That fine speech and call on Mr. Exton to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
I have like zero sense of humor, so mine's going to be a bit more morbid. I will say something that has been said before many times in this house, in other venues and streets and conference halls across the planet. The planet is facing climate breakdown. As we speak, complex ecological systems are steadily breaking down, creating knock-on effects across the planet that threaten the food and water security of billions of people, threaten the existence of thousands of species and of animals and plants, and threaten the ability of this 1 in a million planet to sustain life. 97% of scientists agree we are facing a climate crisis, one that will alter civilization as we know it and lead to the complete destruction of billions of years of evolution in mere decades. And yet, leaders are doing little to nothing. As people across the globe gather time and time again on streets calling for climate justice, our leaders continue to sit in their stuffy halls and discuss how best to generate profit for their own coffers. According to Oxfam's report Profiting from Pain, in 2022, the 10 richest men had greater wealth than the poorest 40% of humanity. And climate change exacerbates these divides, widening the gap through inflation caused by food insecurity, by forcing billions of people to become refugees, by allowing wealthy fossil fuel companies like Shell to continue to boost their profits. I ask you, how real is blameless inequality when Shell in 2022 reported its highest profits in its 115-year history? It is clear that we need to do something about this inaction. And I have to say that those that can sit back and simply ignore this are the privileged ones. As we have seen over the past 5 years, young people in particular have risen up across the globe, leading millions of people in marches through their streets. I myself founded my local branch of the Fridays for Future movement and was a founding member of the national branch. I organised demonstrations and led chants. I drafted the motion from my local council to declare a climate and biodiversity emergency. I attended global conferences such as COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, and more recently the United Nations General Assembly in New York just this past month, existing both within the rooms where discussions occurred and without, with my fellow activists calling for more radical change. I have sat at the table with ministers, mayors, world leaders, and the UN Secretary General himself, and I have interrupted their speeches, carried posters, disrupted their campaigns in attempts to greenwash. I have gone through every possible avenue I can think of as a young person, at every possible level, and yet I feel the response to both my activism and that of my colleagues has mostly been ignorance, a continuation of business as usual after some small superficial changes if we are lucky. Perhaps it is time for something more. something that begins to break the boundaries of the broken legal system, that allows corporations to continue their destructive behaviour and allows governments to subsidise fossil fuel companies, that refuses to recognise the rights of future generations and the rights of our planet and its ecosystems to simply exist. And perhaps what we need to do will be branded ecoterrorism. Over the last few years in particular, there's been a rising hostility towards climate activists. In 2021, the Filipino Supreme Court decided to uphold the so-called terror law, which punishes any individual who is seen to have incited terrorism through speeches, proclamations, writings, emblems, banners, and other representations. Although the Supreme Court have argued this law is necessary to prevent the rise of insurgencies, many human rights and activist groups such as Amnesty International Philippines have criticised the law, saying that even with the Supreme Court's decision, the law still allows the police and military to detain suspects without a warrant or charge for up to 24 days, grants overbroad powers to security forces to conduct surveillance, and allows the Anti-Terrorism Council to designate groups and individuals as terrorists without any due process. Laws like this allow governments to directly target groups they see as a threat to their power, including non-violent climate activist groups and individuals such as Steve Towley, who was reportedly beaten up and abducted by the state security forces of the Philippines. Previously, he had been essentially blacklisted by the government for his activism with the indigenous rights groups Cordillera People's Alliance. He was found 24 hours after his abduction and recounted how he was forced into a vehicle, blindfolded, handcuffed, threatened and interrogated throughout his captivity by unidentified armed persons. This leads me to a question I believe has been integral to this conversation. Is terrorism just aggression or perceived aggression that is not backed by the nation state, by a nation state? Countless times we have seen those rising up against oppressors branded as terrorists, while the oppressors themselves continue their violent, destructive behaviour. How is climate activism any different? How is it fair that those calling on leaders and those in power to protect our future, to secure our rights and that of our planet, people who are risking their lives and livelihoods for everyone else's, are branded terrorists, while the United Kingdom approves the Rosebank oil field, while the United States approves the Willow Project, while Ireland approves 3 new Amazon data centres in Dublin? We are already branded terrorists by those in power. We already threaten leaders by our mere existence, but speaking their language alone has not worked. Perhaps we need to meet them on their terms, to threaten but not enact violence, to remind leaders the serious reality we are facing within mere decades. In 1948, the Nakba, or catastrophe, occurred in Palestine, as thousands of Palestinians were forced off their land to allow for Israeli settlement. Layla Khaled remembers the experience of being in a refugee camp in Tyre in the south of Lebanon. She is the first known woman to hijack a plane, a portrait of her carrying an AK-47 becoming a symbol of Palestinian resistance. In 1967, she and other members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, boarded a flight. In her pocket, she had a hand grenade. Layla and her PFLP colleagues had strict orders not to harm anyone. She showed the captain her hand grenade, told him she was the new captain, and ordered him to fly over Haifa, the town where she was born, the home she hadn't seen in years. She described in an interview earlier this year how she wanted the world to know she wasn't just a refugee who needed aid and lived in tents, but a person with a cause. After the PFLP had diverted the flight to Damascus in Syria, she apologized to the passengers and told them she was very sorry if they were afraid and that they were safe. She says that all the passengers were released and went back to their homes, but that she didn't get to go back to her home. She still cannot return to Haifa. Her life was not ruined by her actions, but was ruined by the oppression against her. Sorry, wrong page. Perhaps Layla's actions contributed nothing to the movement for Palestinian liberation. Perhaps they furthered the narrative of Palestinians as terrorists, as Israelis as the rightful owners of Palestinian land. Regardless, she used the threat of violence and the threat alone to garner attention. And it worked. Layla's image became iconic and reminded people across the planet of what Israel had tried to suppress, that Palestinian people are living and real and tangible, and that they are humans in want of their future and their land. We must remember in this house that we humans are not separate from ecosystems. In fact, we are nature defending itself. We cannot stand by and allow the great maw of exploitative and destructive capitalism to guzzle up our land. We must stand fearlessly between the present and the future so that our children and our children's children have a clean and healthy planet and an equitable life. To paraphrase the great Irish poet Kathleen Maud, we must break down the house we've built in order to build a new one. Thank you.
Tonight's debate. Here.
Good evening, and thank you for having me here. Delighted to be here. It was 2019, I think, was the last time I was here in person, and on that occasion, I was speaking basically in favour of violent actions to promote climate action. So that's a puzzle, because tonight I find myself on this side of the floor. So how did that happen? One of two possibilities. One, I had an epiphany. Two, they made me do it. I'll let you guys figure that one out. Okay, so the great thing, by the way, about being the last speaker of 8 in a room where the CO2 levels have hit about 2,000, right, is that you get to recycle, which is something we all should do more of, right? There's some great points made, so I get to sit there and recycle those points backwards, right? So that's where we're coming from. So I'm going to start with a proposition, if you like. Okay. Carbon emissions, very abstract thing. As I said, you can feel it in this room. You can literally feel the CO2 in this room, okay? That's what it would feel like in a hotter world, okay? But leave that aside for a second. A study published recently, and it calculated that for every 4,500 tons of CO2 emitted, okay, one person dies, okay? So Ireland in 2022 emitted 68 million tons. Little, tiny, 5 million, it hardly even notices Ireland. 68 million tons. That means somewhere in the world, over the coming decades, 15,000 people will lose their lives as a result of the carbon emissions just from Little Ireland. It's a remarkable thing. Multiply that then across the world and you begin to get a picture. So that's the sort of backdrop, the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, Antonio Guterres was referenced briefly earlier, but he's the UN Secretary General. He's been, as you probably know, extremely outspoken on the climate emergency. And he said this earlier this year that really stuck in my mind, and I've used it in a couple of articles since. He said climate activists are depicted as dangerous radicals. Yet the truly dangerous radicals are the countries and firms continuing to burn and promote fossil fuels. Now, in prepping for tonight, I really did do my best to find decent examples of, quote, eco-terrorists. I really did. I'll be honest with you, they're not there. Yet. And I let that word yet hang in the air for a little bit. Last year, in India and parts of Pakistan, we had what are called wet bulb temperatures that came within 2, possibly 1 degree of a mass fatality event. What's a mass fatality event look like? 10, 20, 50 million people dying of heat stroke, heat exhaustion. Right? We came within a hair's breadth. And lest we forget, last year was a La Nina year. Next year is an El Nino year, which in simple meteorological terms means 2024 is going to be hotter than 2023. 2023 is going to be the hottest year in recorded history, not just in the 170 years of instrumental recorded history, but since the mid-Eemian period, 125,000 years ago. That's 2023. We're living in the middle of something completely extraordinary, unprecedented, blow your socks clean off. And yes, there are eco-terrorists driving this catastrophe. These eco-terrorists, they've been alluded to by my colleague earlier, there absolutely are eco-terrorists. These are the fossil fuel companies, the big livestock industry, PLCs, who knowingly, with full oversight of this, and bear in mind that some of the best scientific work of the last 60 years was carried out by fossil fuel geologists. They needed to know things like, how much is the sea level going to rise? You know, is Arctic sea ice going to melt? Because they had to put out things like oil rigs. They needed to understand physics and geology. They had the best science. They published this stuff, and then they hid it. They knew their charts, their calculations, and it's really quite eerie to see them, say charts from the late 70s, early 80s, all these hand-drawn charts, right? I could take one of them now. They usually look something like this. They're exponential curves. They knew absolutely 100% with complete clarity that their business model involved destabilizing the Earth's climatic system upon which we depend. They knew that. Their scientists went to them and said, guys, we got some bad news. We're going to burn the world down. If we get global surface temperatures rising 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees centigrade, average this century, it's game over. Now, that might seem extreme, but right now, let's just, for a moment, focus on mammals. Let's be mammal-centric, okay? If you take all the mammalian biomass in the world, right, and put it on a kind of a cosmic weighing scales, on one side, 96% of the weight of all the mammals in the world are humans and our livestock. 4% of the world's mammals by weight are wild animals. So, the apocalypse that you hear people warning about, it's already happened. It just hasn't happened to us yet. We have destroyed the world. I mean, just, I started primary school in 1970, right? So it's a million years ago. It doesn't feel like it to me. It might seem like it to you guys, but not to me. Anyway, from that day to this, 69% of all the wild animals, all the fish, all the birds, all the big noises, all the bangs, 69%, more than 2/3 of all wild creatures have disappeared since I started in primary school. Now, the reason I use that particular analogy is, kick yourself forward 40 years. That takes us out to the 2060s. What are we looking at in the 2060s? The best science that we have for the 2060s, between the 2050s and 2070s, 2060s is a good thing. It brings you roughly in your lives to where I am now, okay? We're looking at somewhere between, if we're super lucky, 1,000 million climate refugees. And if we're not so lucky, 3,000 million climate refugees by the time you guys are my age. So yeah, there's eco-terrorists. They're all around you. And they look like people like me. We have fucked it for all of you. And on behalf of my generation, I fucking apologize. I apologize to my own kids who are exactly your age. I could say we didn't know, or we were too stupid, or we were too greedy, but we have left you a shit sandwich from hell. And I'm sorry. I mean it. I'm really fucking sorry. So, remember I mentioned that there aren't that many eco-terrorists? There will be. There will be a lot of eco-terrorists. At the moment, they wear suits and they live in mansions. But pretty soon, this fight will come to their door. When people start dying in their droves, and I'm sorry to say, and feel free to mark my words from this evening, it will happen this decade. There are going to be mass mortality events this bloody decade. People are going to get very angry, and you know what they're going to do? Repression, brutality, police state. Look what Britain, right next door, has already done. They have criminalised holding up a sign has been made a criminal offence. They're smashing down on climate protesters because they know what's coming. They know the trouble is coming. So basically, folks, we got a great big war coming up. You see, they left me at the end to lighten the mood, to send you all home going, woohoo! Yeah. But it just, anyway, this is I've spent 20 years pretty much looking at nothing else except this unfolding disaster. As a journalist, as a parent, as a human being. 20 years. 15 of that in the public domain, writing, speaking, arguing, pleading, begging people to do something about this. And I'm sorry to say, nobody's listening. Now, I'm supposed at this stage to say something uplifting and say, you guys are going to turn this around. I hope so. But I will conclude by saying, we're in the fight of our lives, and I wish you all the very best with it. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Gibbons and Neil, all speakers, for a wonderful debate. What we're going to do now is a vote. But before that, just to let you know, we have a wine reception next door. I certainly need a drink after the debate tonight. But with that, before that, we must call a vote. So I'm going to say in a second, all those in favour of the motion to say aye, and all those against the motion to say nay. I'm just giving you a warning that both will be coming back to back, so be ready. All those in favour of the motion? Aye. And all those against? Nay. I believe the nays have it. Thank you all very much.